another meeting this month. I will, we have a single item on the open agenda that we're going to have a chance for us to have a workshop discussion around. So I will first ask for an adoption of the agenda as amended to have the correct date on it.
So moved.
Who's seconded? All in favor, all opposed, carried. And we will start with a public engagement workshop. And I'll just maybe a little bit of a preamble to this. A couple of times over the last year, or since I've been on the board anyway, we've had discussions about doing better engagement in our budgeting discussions. Actually, we're talking about having our goal of doing better engagement with the public on everything we do as a police board. But I think coming up to the budget discussion, we've been having discussions about how are we going to actually engage the public on the decisions we make in public engagement. And we in the city have been going through a bit of an education in the last couple of years about what public engagement is and what public engagement isn't. And so I thought it'd be useful to have our city folks who lead that group for us to talk to the board about how we ask questions and why we ask questions and how we're going to use the information we get when we ask questions to make public engagement actually meaningful, both for the public and for us. So we have Jennifer and Zaria here from our public engagement department at the city, and maybe we should do a quick roundtable so you know who everyone in the room is. I'll throw you over to this stranger over here you've never met before.
Hi, Mary Trentadue. I'm on the police board.
Andrew Perry, I'm the Inspector of Administration here at the department.
Hello, Drew Hart, I'm one of the board members.
Hello, Jacqueline Jared, I'm manager of finance at the police department. I'm the board member.
Paul Highland, Deputy Chief.
Patrick Johnson, I'm the chair.
Daisy Dye, board secretary.
Alejandro Diaz,
No, I was just introduced by the chair, so it's okay. I'm Jennifer with public engagement at the city. Go ahead.
Alejandro, board member.
Daria, also the public engagement.
Okay, so I guess you have a bit of a package you want to put together for it. Go and let us know when you want us to engage and when you want us to get questions for us. But I hand the floor over to you.
Sounds great, thank you. I'm just going to get the presentation up here onto the screen. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to come. Patrick has just shared a bit about the origins of why we're here today. So we've decided in consultation with the chair, with Mayor Johnstone, we've structured this as more of an engagement 101 kind of workshop. So we will eventually get to some discussion regarding budget engagement on the police budget, but we wanted to give you kind of some foundational principles about what is public engagement and some of the key things that we tried to build into all of our engagement processes at the city to make them meaningful and authentic. So bear with us as we kind of work through some content, and then we will eventually talk about budget engagement. We've designed this to be really interactive. So we have questions for you kind of throughout the session. And also please feel free to jump in and ask us questions as we go as well. We really want this to be more of a workshop style and discussion. So hopefully you'll actively participate. All right, so who are we? There we go. So just a little bit of context about us as a team and the work that we do at the city. So as Mayor Johnstone shared, we are a distinct department at the City of New West, and we are separate from communications on purpose. So communications and public engagement work really closely together. And we do a lot of communicating when we do engagement processes, but we are separate for a reason. So the way I kind of explain to people what my job is I do it in contrast to communications. So communications, we're sharing messages out, we're saying things, we're talking. Public engagement is about listening. So we help the city to listen to the community and the people who are affected by the decisions that we make as an organization, as a local government. So we are a two-person team, so quite small, but we describe ourselves as small but mighty, a phrase you hear a lot around the City of New West. But we are growing. We actually are in a recruitment process right now to have a third team member. So I also want to just highlight that our structure in the city is with us as a support role. So we're often out there as a public face of engagement that's happening at the city. So you'll see us at pop-ups around town and facilitating workshops, and presenting findings of engagement sometimes at city council. But we really do this work in partnership with project teams and city departments. We're not the ones who are driving the engagement that needs to happen. It comes out of the city's work plan and departmental work plans and the projects that they have going on. Sometimes we step in to say, I think you need to do some public engagement on this project, but often the driver is that work plan and what decisions are coming up at the city. So it's not us who's starting that process of saying, what can we engage on next? It really is the city's work plan. So just to bring it back to that budget piece, Jacqueline will remember that, really the city's budget engagement is a partnership with the finance team and all of senior leadership. It's like kind of a citywide thing. So that's not work that we do in isolation. We work very closely with city departments and the finance team to develop what are the questions we're asking, what are the processes we're going to do. So it's really a partnership. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Zaria. And we did some introductions, but we do want to spend a little bit of time getting to know folks who are here.
Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. We're going to start right at the top before we dive into our definitions of what public engagement is or some of the principles that we like to try to model within our work. We're going to talk about connection before content. So if you've seen us in action before or attended one of our workshops, you'll notice that this is sort of like a principle that we like to try to embody. And what this means is to intentionally build time into our agendas and our sessions to connect with one another. And we do this often by gathering over a meal or some refreshments or making time to do an icebreaker or share some personal stories and experiences. And this is based on the fact that true meaningful public engagement is built off of relationships. And so by allowing for opportunities for relationships to form, we're setting the foundation for trust building, open-mindedness, and sharing of differing opinions. And so those are elements that really help to build a genuine engagement process. Yeah, next slide. So in modeling this best practice, we're going to do an icebreaker today as well. If you'll indulge us in a round, we can do around the table as we just did with introductions, but this time we want you to think about a time where you participated in an engagement in your personal life, perhaps, whether that's taking a survey or attending a session or a workshop. Share a brief story about that experience and maybe share why or what motivated you to participate in that engagement. Does anyone have a experience off the top of their head that they wanted to share? And then we can
Patrick does.
go around that way.
It looked like you just had something to say.
I have to separate this from my work life because I'm kind of at the other in that weird world of engagement every time whenever I go to a city engagement thing. And I often try to avoid them now because when I show up in the room in this role ends up putting you in a weird place where people want to talk to you or talk at you instead of actually engaging in the conversation with the community. So that's a weird thing for me when I show up at these events now. But I was recently at one that it was held at the Anvil about the BC, Royal BC Museum. They were having a roundtable discussions with community about their fate and what they want to do and how they want to change or update their program. And it was kind of fun to be part of that as someone who was kind of just an engaged person in the community again, instead of being the person who's kind of being engaged to or being communicated at. And so it was an interesting event. I was surrounded by a bunch of people who were really into museums, and I was surrounded by archivists and museum folks and librarians and folks like that who were really into that kind of thing, and historians. And I was just kind of an interested resident, which was interesting to hear how they talked about what they do versus how I, as a random person walking on off the street, understands what they do. It was an interesting engagement. It was fun. Now Mary wants to.
So mean. It's funny, I can think of certainly situations where I was the one listening, not the one contributing. So, I guess I can think back to a situation where I went to an event put on by the Y, and it was about this neighborhood small grants. And so everyone came to this session to learn about the small grants and to understand what they could do in New West. And I wanted to also participate in this small grant. So I was there as a participant, not as a listener. And I just was so struck by how many different people were in the room that I'd never seen before. And it was really quite inspiring to see that, you know, when you live in your own circle and you see the same people, the same things all the time, you think that's the world. And then you go to something where there's so many other people participating, it makes you realize, well, there's just a lot more people living here and participating in their community than I realized. So it's about, for me, it was a real lesson in the bigness of our community when it sometimes seems so small, that there's all these other pockets of people that you don't know about until you actually step out of your box and go to other things. So I thought it was a really interesting experience to see who else was here.
So actually, that's not an engagement that has happened yet. I'm part of my restaurant is in downtown US. BIA is having a public engagement on Friday. There was some feedback about what's happening in downtown US, crime, police, homeless. And I really think that I'm very passionate, but I'm also very scared of what's going to happen in that meeting, because I think that for me, my vision is a little bit different. I have a business in US for like the past 9 years. I feel very safe. I think that there are people that don't have a house, but I think that they're like good people. From time to time, things happen. And I think that for me, I want to go into an engagement where basically I'm scared that the feedback is going to be very negative. Where I think that for me, I want to bring the positive side of like, you know, I have staff members that are like 16, 17, 18-year-old female, they feel safe. I haven't had like any incidents with the police or with homeless or like drug acts or anything over the past 9 years. So I'm very excited, but also I'm very scared of how is that going to be well received. Yeah, that's hasn't happened yet, but that's
Yeah, I did a workshop, probably 6 months ago through work on EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, which was quite interesting. Okay, I think everyone knows that. That's the perspective I was interested to go from, but it was really interesting to hear all the other perspectives around the table, because I'm also very privileged being a white man. That it was just really interesting and enlightening to hear the perspectives of all the other folks coming to the table. And just looking at the question around what motivated you, and I guess it's a question I have around how we get folks engaged. I did this because I'm personally interested in it, but how do we get meaningful engagement from a broad group when they don't necessarily know much about it? I guess that's part of the answer we need to make them know, but how do we draw people in?
You want us to answer that right now? Yeah.
Sure.
We can, I mean, a lot of the answer, I mean, it's a complicated answer, but to boil it down, I would say, we need to communicate really clearly and directly how people could be impacted by whatever project or decision we're working on. And that should be a motivation to get involved. So right now at the city, we're working on launching some engagement around the Parks and Recreation Comprehensive Plan. So like this is a 25-year future plan that's going to, you know, dictate like investments in parks and recreation across New Westminster for a very long time horizon. And so like that will literally touch everyone who lives here. So, you know, we're working on that messaging right now. And I really want us to be like really direct about this will impact you. We need you to participate and share what your needs are for Parks and Rec. So that's, I think, a key part of the answer. Thanks for that question.
Thanks. At work, we do a lot of engagement, and I think what motivates me to participate is really how likely I feel like our feedback will be taken, because I think there's a lot of engagement that, at least Evergreen Healthcare, where it's kind of like a tick box and you know, you're sitting at the table to say a few things, but they have like something in mind and they're gonna move forward on a trajectory, right? And so in cases where I felt like actually we're sitting down and there's potential to make change, then I'm motivated to participate. Otherwise, I'm less motivated to participate, and it's more, and you can usually kind of, at least personally, I've worked in the field long enough to kind of know how likely it's gonna give feedback, but that's kind of my takeaway for this. Like, why do we have wiggle room on? Because there's lots of things in our budget that we don't, and so wanting to design anything we do in a way that motivates people because we could actually change versus asking questions that we're not even willing to move forward with.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Heather. I think that really connects with Drew's question. And one of the ways that we can help people to participate over time is by demonstrating how their voice had an impact. And you know, often people will spend the time to participate, not see where it went, and then feel that it was a waste of time and maybe they're not going to participate again. So I actually feel that, you know, we would use the term engagement fatigue. The nugget of engagement fatigue is that people have participated, have not seen any impact from that participation, and so they're like, no, I'm not doing that again. So yeah, thanks, really important. I think if any staff are really wanting to jump in with a story, you're welcome to, but in the interest of time, maybe we'll suggest we keep moving. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing. And I think a part of the stories and experiences that were shared kind of touch on this definition and this formal explanation of what we mean by engagement. And you know, we hear this word being thrown around a lot, and it's kind of a buzzword these days. And people say that, you know, our community is so engaged when they mean that the community is tapped into what's going on, or they're active and participants in civil society, or you know, people say that we want to engage with our stakeholders, but they really mean we have some messaging to share with them and we want to let them know what we're doing. But as a city, this is our formal definition of what we mean by public engagement. And this is from our public engagement policy, where we say that public engagement is the principle that those impacted by a decision have a right to be included in the decision-making process. So very similar to what Heather you were saying. You may also hear the terms public participation, community consultation, or participatory decision-making being used, and these all mean the same thing as engagement. It's a formal process of gathering input from those who may be affected or perceived to be impacted by a decision to help influence the outcome. And so there's two really important pieces of that definition that I wanted to touch on. It's one, that there needs to be a process for gathering input, and two, that this input would help shape a decision or outcome. And without either of those two pieces of the equation, what we're doing is not engagement. There also needs to be a decision or outcome to support purposeful listening. Engagement is not a checkbox, so we're only asking questions that we really want the answers to. So in other words, we're listening with intent to do something with what we hear. Engagement is also a two-way conversation, so it's not people yelling at us through a microphone for 5 minutes. It's purposeful and crafted dialogue that supports the decision-making process. And finally, there's a commitment as on the decision makers' behalf to incorporate input. And so we're not just asking for feedback for the sake of asking. We want to do something with what we hear. So the bottom line of that, if you leave with one takeaway from my rambling, it's that engagement is shared decision making. So we passed out a copy of this infographic that we developed, and this was a suggestion that was brought to us by a community member to hopefully address and explain what we mean by public engagement in a really simple and visual way. I won't spend time going through each of the frames one by one, but it gives a simple overview of what an engagement process would or could look like. And in this example, we're talking about development of a city park, something that was relevant and familiar to most members of our community.
So I want to spend just a couple of minutes kind of making a distinction between public engagement and some other activities that can often be conflated with public engagement. And like Zaria said, engagement is a word that's used a lot in the world right now and to mean a lot of different things. So I'd like to suggest that marketing or public relations is not public engagement. I've often heard in my work as an engagement practitioner, we need to bring people along. If we already know where we're going and what the outcome is going to be, and we really are trying to convince people, I'd like to suggest that's more of a PR exercise or marketing, or maybe an education campaign, but it doesn't sound like to me we're listening or open to influence in a process like that. Public engagement as we do it and as defined by the city is also distinct from public opinion research or polling. And I think this is a relevant example because the police department recently did some polling through Ipsos. Public engagement is participation by choice. It's distinct from that representative sample that you get from a polling firm. It also, when you do things like polling, it's usually, it needs to be done by an external organization like an Ipsos Reid or someone like that. So it doesn't have that relationship building and that trust building and that two-way conversation piece. It really is just harvesting opinions from the community as opposed to having a dialogue and building that trust and building that relationship. And it's also not a vote. So we hear this word a lot in our engagement work. And we're trying to let the community know that that's not what this is. You know, often we'll do surveys, and if we see 51% say option A, that doesn't mean we're going to do option A. It's, again, we're trying to have more of a dialogue. It's not really about majority rules. And we're really trying to build compromise and build consensus as a community and help people to listen to other views. So we try not to frame things as a vote. And it shouldn't be considered a vote. All right, so we want to pause here and just kind of check in with you on how this is all kind of landing so far. And, you know, if you have any reflections or thoughts on our definition and description of what is public engagement and what it's not. And if you have any thoughts on why this is important for you as a board to think about public engagement.
How did you change the people's mind that now everything is social media? Like I think that when you go to a full engagement, you have a chance to say, Mary, I don't like you, or I like you. And I think that, you know, and then you can say because of this, and this. But unfortunately, we don't do it because, you know, it's difficult. But in social media, I can say all these things. So I really think that social media takes so much away from that, and then the results couldn't be that accurate. And so how do you take away from, how do you counter with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is really tricky. I think as a city, we don't do formal engagement through social media. Sometimes we will include some comments from social media if they're relevant to our engagement topic. But we really encourage people. So I didn't mention, sorry, in the intro that we run the Be Heard New West website. So we use social media to let people know that we're engaging, but we send them to Be Heard New West, where you know, we do things like discussion forums, but they're moderated, and you know, if there is a more respectful space to have online conversations than social media. So that's some of the ways we do use social media a lot to let people know that we're engaging. But we try to send them to other spots to share. Zaria?
Yeah, I think also we do see patterns or trends where some of the rhetoric that we see on social media trickles into some of the formal engagement input that we collect. And it's challenging when a lot of that conversation online on social media is stemmed with misinformation or disinformation, and having that kind of weave its way into a formal process that we put out where we try to ground everything in fact and truth. It's challenging sometimes.
Yeah, because I talk to at least 100 people a day. Yeah. And you know, I heard like if it's Facebook, it must be true. And it's really scary because I think that it's scary.
People take things at face value, yeah.
Oh, just a quick question. How important from the public engagement side is providing context or kind of a background? Jennifer mentioned the Ipsos polling that we did, and what kind of came out of that was a lot of people like, I don't know, I don't know what the police do unless I call them. So again, depending on where the board decides to go, you don't want to force the engagement to one way or the other, but how do you provide just context for people so they can weigh in and have more of an informed kind of opinion about?
Yeah, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this a little bit later, but absolutely. So I said before, communications and public engagement are really closely tied together, and we do a lot of communications as part of our engagement process. And so information sharing is huge. And one of the key principles of public engagement is that people need information in order to participate. So uninformed feedback is likely not that helpful to us and likely not that applicable to what we're doing. So we do build information sharing and education throughout all of our work. So, we have different ways we can do this. So we, provide information on the Be Heard page or through like display boards at an events. Sometimes we do like a little webinar and then record that and have a video that people can watch if they prefer that. We have frequently asked questions. And when we do things like surveys, we'll build in some information context before a question. So it's kind of, there's lots of different ways that we do that, but it's such an important part to provide people with context and information before we ask.
I think an important part of that last slide is that like polling and marketing and communications, I think they exist sort of parallel to public engagement, and it's not one or the other, right? They're not a separated things. They're actually two things that operate kind of in different purposes, but they have to operate together. We need communications in order to have proper engagement, because unless we are actually communicating what's going on, again, people live in an information void, and engagement's useless then if they don't know what's actually happening.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it's a really good point as well. And some cities and other organizations are doing parallel processes where they'll have an opt-in public engagement process where it's participation by choice, and then they'll do some polling alongside that, and to see, then you can compare and contrast the results and see, does a representative sample feel the same way as the opt-in group? I think we've all experienced that people who are usually feel very strongly one way or another about something are the most likely to opt in to participate. So we're always kind of grappling with, okay, is this actually the sentiment broadly, or is it just the loud voices? So that kind of thing can help with that. I was also going to say, I think we've been talking a little bit really recently about, helping our colleagues and decision makers to understand, like, what is the primary goal you have? If the primary goal is sharing information, and like maybe you're trying to shoehorn a question in for the public, maybe you really are looking at a communications process, and we want to like kind of lean you towards that. But if your main objective is really like, oh, we need to hear from the community to make this decision, like there's some real input that's missing, or a real question, like we're really curious about something that we don't already know or we haven't heard before, then that's more, tipping the scales towards an engagement process. So I think it's like, there's an equation in there somewhere. We're not math people, we're words people, but, and people. But yeah, I think it's grappling with, well, like, what are we actually trying to do here? And getting really honest about, are we just trying to educate people? Because then if we call it engagement and we're not going to really do anything with what we've heard, that actually can do more damage and erode trust. We have a couple other questions to think about, and if you have thoughts on this, but consider some of your recent decisions as a board, you are a decision-making body. Are there times when input from the public could have helped you with aspects of a specific decision? And then on the other hand, like, or conversely, are there situations you can think of when engagement would not be appropriate or beneficial? If anything's coming to mind, feel free to jump in. any thoughts on like,
You
when
must-
is engagement
Is that?
not appropriate?
You must be able to answer one of these.
I think it's not appropriate if like there's not capacity or willingness to change. So like, if we were in a budget year where we were so tight we couldn't change anything, then let's not ask for an opinion, right? So I think like that's for me is something we have to consider is like, where is our spaces of wiggle room and where are we willing to change? Because we actually do have a lot of things that need to just go forward, right? Like that we don't actually, we need police cars, we need police officers. There's only certain things where we're gonna have, and so I think that's like kind of what I'm grappling in my head with is like, what would we actually ask the public? Because there's lots of things that are just not really on the table at this point for the public, yeah.
This sort of gets into our operational versus strategic planning
Yeah.
sort of dichotomy here, right?
Exactly.
Say that.
So much of
Yeah.
our public facing work the police do is operational work that the police board doesn't really engage in. And it really, we're about giving future direction to, and budget management, like for the organizations, so. Yeah. We got into this conversation around the budget. And maybe that's a question of like, I think the board had a feeling that we want to engage more in the budget and have more public feedback into how the budget is, how we make our budget decisions, but that's kind of why we're here. We're trying to figure out what that means and how we would actually do that.
And whether is it for this budget, is it for a long-term thing, right? Cause like long-term, you can make more changes versus just an annual kind of question. It's kind of in my head.
Yeah, I think, you know, I probably should have said this earlier, but as we work through this content, I would like you to think about like, maybe there's engagement on other topics, like maybe it's not the budget and maybe that's not the place to start. If you're looking to get into public engagement as a board, you know, maybe there are other places. So hence a question like this, are there times you can think of when, you know, having some public input could have helped you in decision-making? Yeah, sorry, someone was gonna jump in.
I got, the question I was gonna ask, you know, the board, last year sort of went through a lengthy, budget process, starting probably May, June, in open, meetings. Which is to some degree, I guess, community engagement, because the community or the public's welcome to attend the open portions. Like, is that something that could be considered as far as driving more interest in that process, where people could come, listen, or, I mean, to me, that's what, I mean, the board does that almost on a monthly basis. Probably starting about May, we'll start producing draft budgets, provisional budgets, and it's really an opportunity for anyone to come and speak to that. And that's maybe a gap that we're like, how do we drive more interest in the meetings or in that process?
How are people invited to participate in board meetings, members of the
I
public?
think it's on Twitter or something.
Social media.
No, I mean really specifically, like if you show up, like I live in New West, if I show up as a resident,
Where do you go?
yeah, can I speak at the
No.
meeting?
Not unless you're.
You can sign up to
as a-
delegate if you wish,
Yeah.
yes.
Is that something that's like out there in the public that people know they can sign up to do a delegation?
I would say maybe one
We
person
have-
knows.
We've had a few delegations, but it's not very common. I feel like it's on the
Yeah.
website, but downtown.
It's on the website.
Yeah, it's on the website. We don't actively invite people in, but there is a public facing part on our website that says you can delegate to this board, so it's.
I guess where I struggle around the budget engagement is, it's quite abstract from like a public perspective. It's more like, what are the,
It's abstract from our perspective.
but that's very perfect too, yeah. And really, you look at the bulk of its labor, right, it is, and what is that actually translating into? For me, that's the piece that's missing, like what are priorities or concerns of the community, and then how are we addressing that through the budget? Because just when, like, our budget conversations aren't really about that, it's like they're just going, this many for this division and this for that, but it's not really clear what does that actually translate into.
Yeah, what is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is the, yeah.
I
What is
think
the-
Well, because it,
What are the service
like,
outcomes? Yeah.
the way that we've got to the budget, like last year, it's open, so the public can see it, whatever, but what does that actually mean? Like, what is that, what are we addressing? What priorities are being targeted through that, or what? And that isn't really transparent or public, or clear or public.
I was just gonna say that, you know, even when I was on council, I didn't really recall that many people engaging on the budget, like to the extent that you would think they would or hope they would. And we tried a lot of different things to get people to engage. I mean, I guess if you said there's going to be a 30% increase, you know, you'd get some engagement, but it's people come out, yeah, sure, feedback. People come out when they feel there's something at stake that they need to speak to. But I think that, as Drew has said, I think it's very difficult for the average person to pay attention, first of all, and then to think that they have something to contribute to the police budget or not, and just to kind of wade in to the process is very, very difficult. So I don't know that it's really the best place for us to say, let's start our engagement here, because I've seen in council it doesn't really work, and that's kind of more far-reaching. I mean, you get to think about parks and libraries and things that really impact people, but policing doesn't always impact people unless they're impacted by it. You know, it's not something they often think about all the time. So I don't know that it's the best place for us to do public engagement.
I think it's more as we do a strategic plan refresh.
Yes, that's more interesting.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's where we identify priorities or concerns,
Policy
areas.
yeah.
And then it's our work to translate that into how is the budget supporting that?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that, Drew. Yeah, I don't think the budget's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be very transparent that the city budget is like the hardest engagement to root on every year.
Yeah.
And I'm actually hoping that we're maybe not gonna do like a fulsome budget engagement process every year as a
Yeah,
city,
yeah.
because it's huge,
Yeah.
it's abstract.
Yeah.
It's just hard for people to wrap their heads around. And then from an engagement perspective, it's really hard to draw that clear line between what did we hear and how does that show up in the final budget?
Yeah, like even for the city, like I filled out those city ones, but how likely are they to take the feedback if it's like reducing parks and recs by 20% and increasing fire? You know what I mean? That has big impacts. Like, I don't even know how much you can really take from that city one, to be honest.
But the other conversation we've been having recently is that every engagement we have in the city is effectively a budget engagement, because that's how we
Sure.
decide and we prioritize things.
Sure. But
This
that,
Parks and Recreation Comprehensive Plan is going to be
yeah,
a budget informing piece of.
but that's way
consultation.
easier for people to get their head around
Right.
than an operating and a capital and like,
Yeah.
like that, you know, it's really hard when you even study the reports every week, but let alone a public person who also is managing their life. So I just think it's not a good idea.
We all
Okay,
kind of look.
so you
I was just thinking about that, like, it's so easy to engage on what you want, and, you know, I want this, I want that, but then having that divorce conversation from, what does it cost to get what you want? It's really, and you kind of come up with these ideas of plans that you want, budget PCI, it has to be so integrated into that conversation.
But I can see what coming out of this would be like, oh, we want the Vancouver model where they have a lot of site nurses and this and that, and like, do we even have capacity for that? You know what I mean? Like, that's the piece we have to think about.
Well, it's a joke I've used often on council. It's like, council is 11 months of people telling you the things they want, and then 1 month of people telling you they don't want to pay for anything.
Yeah.
That's the last 11 months. That's,
It's tricky for sure. Okay, shall we move on? All right. Thanks, everyone. Really good discussion. This is what we were hoping to get out of today, so I really appreciate it. All right, so the work that we do in public engagement is informed by a professional body that's called International Association for Public Participation. It's quite a mouthful. IAP2 is the short version of that. So IAP2 has developed a fulsome process and methodology for how to do public engagement. And they do have training courses if you are interested in knowing or learning more about this subject. They have also developed various tools as well. And I think the best known tool that they have is this image you see on the screen, which is the spectrum of public participation. Many municipalities and other organizations are using this or an adapted version of this to help describe their engagement. It can give us some shared language and understanding about the level of engagement or the level of influence that the public has. So I'm going to walk us through this a little bit, but I just want to first highlight that we've also adapted this is the original that you see here on the screen. But as I've been kind of talking about, we've been talking about all the way through this workshop so far, if we're only communicating out, that's not engagement. We need to be actively listening and have a plan for what we're going to do with what we hear. So we've actually adjusted this to move inform to a different place. So as opposed to it being a specific level on the spectrum of engagement, we've moved it to be at the top and a starting place for all of the other 4 levels. So if we're only communicating out, we're just talking to people and sharing our information, we would argue that's not engagement. But we do need to inform, as we've talked about as well. Like, people need information in order to participate, and that's one of the core values of IAP2 actually, is that people need information to participate. And we also need to tell people how their input influence the outcome. So that communications piece, that inform piece, happens across all of these other levels on the spectrum and throughout the whole process. So people need information about, what is this about? What is their opportunity for influence? How can they participate? And then, we're informing them with some of that framing and contextual information. And then as we get through the process, we're informing them about, here's what we heard and here's what we did with what we heard. So inform is a really key part of the process, but if we're stopping there, then it's not engagement. So these words can really just kind of help us to understand everyone, like from decision makers to staff to participants and members of the public. What kind of level of engagement are we at? What is the opportunity for influence? How much influence is the public having? So I'll kind of just explain these levels briefly, and if you have questions, please let us know. But so consult is usually happens like after a bunch of work has been done, kind of behind the scenes. We've developed probably some options or some choices, and there's something that's like mostly formed, and maybe there's a couple of options that we want to get some feedback on. So typically happens a little bit later in the process, and it's all about options. So do you prefer option A or option B, or some feedback on a draft? That's really the level of consult. So I have a little analogy to share that hopefully will help us to kind of understand all of these levels. And it's about, deciding on your vacation. You're doing a planning to take a trip. So consult would be, you say to your partner or your family, do you want to go to Mexico or do you want to go to Hawaii? You have a couple of options on the table. It's pretty low level of influence. It's like A or B. So, and involved, typically we're a bit earlier in the decision-making process. Not a lot has been formulated. And this is about asking, what's important to you? What are your priorities? What are your concerns? So it's a little bit more open. And again, like it typically will happen earlier in a process. So often we'll do longer projects where we'll have a phase of engagement that's more at the involved level earlier on. Then we'll do a bunch of work to develop some options or a draft, and then we'll come out again and at the consult level to say, okay, do you like A or B, or what's your feedback on our draft? So for the trip planning scenario, this is about, sitting down with your family and saying, like, what's important to you for this vacation? Like, do you want something that's action-packed and like city vibe, or are you looking to relax on a beach? Is it about nature? Like, what's important to you? What are your concerns? Like, what are your priorities for this vacation? And then from there, you kind of start to narrow down the options. Collaborate is all about doing the work together. So we're actively at the table with the community, doing the work together, formulating what some of those options might be. So this is really a partnership proposition. We're like actively doing the work together, actively collaborating. We don't often do this at the city. Most organizations, I would say, are not usually at Collaborate. I'd like to see us doing more of this, but you need to kind of, it takes more effort and needs to start earlier. So in terms of the vacations analogy, at Collaborate, we're really sitting down together with our family members, researching destinations, researching resorts, researching packages. We're kind of in the process together, really doing the work to plan our vacation together. The work is happening collaboratively. Finally, empower. This is super rare, and like the best analogy I can give is a vote or a plebiscite, something like that. This is putting the decision-making power into the hands of the public. So you can still put parameters around it and say, like, within these criteria, we will do what you say. It is really rare for us to be at this place. One of the rare times I would say is participatory budgeting, which is something that the city is hoping to dip our toe into. But basically, the decision is with the public. So in the vacation scenario, again, this looks like you really stepping back and saying to your partner or your family, you know, you decide where we're gonna go. And you can put some parameters around it, say our maximum budget is $5,000, you know, maximum length of time is 2 weeks. But within those parameters, fill your boots. Anything you decide is what we'll do for the vacation. So this, again, can really just kind of help to give us some shared language around how much influence does the public have, and what is their role in this shared decision making. Any questions about this?
If we take nothing away from this meeting, I want it to be this, one thing. This has been a really powerful tool for us to have a conversation, to sometimes just have that talk back at council and just say, what are we actually talking about when we want to talk to the public? Where are we on this spectrum? And it's often humbling, because we often say we really want to collaborate with the public on this, but really we just kind of want to consult with them. Like it's an important thing. This has been a really powerful tool for us in the 2 years probably since you brought this to council in our thinking about how we talk to folks.
Yeah, I see a lot of municipalities, sharing this out with the public as well, so that they understand, or hopefully start to understand what is their level of influence. So we can also, it just kind of helps everyone to be on the same page, but what exactly are we doing here? Yeah, okay. A few more slides for you.
The higher the impact, the greater our need to engage. And this slide is really trying to help us think about when we might need to engage. So what types of situations or projects would require us to go out to the public to seek their input. And as a rule of thumb, we say that the greater the impact, and whether that is on the number of people or groups or businesses, or even the magnitude or significance of the impact of the final decision, the greater our need for engagement is. So the more people that will be impacted, or the more significant the decision is, the more likely engagement is needed. And often those things go hand in hand, where decisions of greater significance impact a larger number of people.
Okay, so a big part of engagement planning and deciding, are we doing engagement, and if so, what are we asking, is this question: what is actually open for influence? And then, just as important, defining what is not, and then being really open with the community about both of those things. So a way to kind of think about this is thinking about the scope of the decision overall, and then within that scope of decision, what is the scope of engagement? So what pieces or aspects, what elements are open for influence? What's still flexible? So we can talk about things in that bigger circle, the blue circle, as being non-negotiables or things that are fixed. We're not open to change on those things, and we need to be upfront about that. People will still likely want to weigh in on the things that are in that blue bubble, but we need to explain why those things are not open for influence. It's really important to keep in mind that the scope of engagement is always smaller than the scope of decision. So in any decisions that we make, there's a ton of stuff that's really not open for influence. And I think the big thing that comes to mind for your context is the Police Act. You can't do anything that's outside of that. So that would be a key thing that's in that blue bubble, in the non-negotiables, in the scope of decision, but is not open for influence, is not part of the scope of engagement. I'll give you another kind of example to kind of help wrap your mind around this. And that's the Agnes Greenway project we did at the city. So you likely know there is a multi-use path that's now been installed on Agnes Street in downtown New West. And when we launched the engagement for that project, the decision had already been made that there would be a path on Agnes Street. That was not open for influence. That decision had been made by council, and it came from a previous downtown transportation plan. There was a previous engagement process to develop that plan, and one of the key projects in that was this Agnes Street Greenway. So when we opened up specific public engagement on the Greenway itself, that project, the decision had already been made that there would be a path there. So the things that were in that scope of engagement bubble were really about the design of the Greenway, the configuration of the Greenway, some of the amenities that you now see along the Greenway, like benches and the little dog skills park thing that's there. Those were the things we were asking the community about. So it wasn't a conversation, some people wanted it to be, but it wasn't a conversation about, do you want this or not? Or where should this go? It was a conversation about what are the specifics, what will this look and feel like? So it's an example of the difference between scope of decision and scope of engagement. Some of the other things that were in that non-negotiables or the scope of decision bucket, the blue circle for that project, were things like the budget. It wasn't open, the project budget wasn't open for influence. And like safety standards. So it was always going to be an all ages and abilities pathway, which means certain things in terms of the width and that separation from vehicles. Those were things that were not open for influence.
I guess I don't really recall a lot of the engagement about the Agnes Greenway. Maybe I wasn't there, I can't remember, but do we ever say these things are not open for engagement? Like, maybe not so bluntly, but how do we really transparently tell people we are not talking about this? And, or do we not do that?
We do absolutely really
Yeah.
try to communicate clearly what the engagement is about and how we will use people's feedback. So, we tried to communicate very clearly on Agnes Greenway that there would be a greenway, and that this was not a conversation about, do you want this or not?
Yeah.
Some people didn't get that message. So it's something that we continue to work on, and how can we communicate really clearly what's open for influence and what isn't.
Yeah.
But absolutely, that really needs to be clear in all of our engagement communications about what is the opportunity for influence here, what are the questions we're asking, and how will we use your feedback?
Yeah, I wonder if it's like ingrained in people that they get to have feedback regardless, because it's their city and they pay taxes. And so I don't care what you've decided, I get to say whether I want it or not. And I wonder if we're always kind of up against that kind of thinking, because I know the city tries to be very positive in its communications, but it would be very easy for people not to understand that that's not up for discussion without actually saying, please don't tell us that you want it or don't, because we don't care. Kind of thing.
That's where we get accused of not listening.
Yeah,
They come in and say that's outside of engagement. Well, you don't want to listen to me. And that people just don't want to take part in the engagement then, because they don't feel listened to.
It's really tough
It's
to
tricky.
pull that apart.
Yeah. The really clear example that comes to my mind is when I first started at the city, the decision had been made to close the recycle depot that's on the Thomas Out space. And there was a lot of pushback from the community. Really didn't want to see that close. And so I think the first engagement that I planned and delivered at the city was about the recycle depot. And literally the first line in our communications was, the recycle depot is closing. Finish. We want to talk to you about how we can support your recycling efforts after the depot is closed. It was still it didn't go over well. I remember really clearly at one of our drop-in sessions, some people came in, walked right up to me and said, is it closing no matter what? And I said, yes. And they're like, well, this is a waste of my time. And they turned around and left.
Right.
But I mean, we're trying to be really upfront about where we're at in the decision-making process and what is open.
Interesting.
I will say that out of that engagement, we've now introduced curbside glass collection. And that was a big thing that we heard from the community about something they wanted to help them with their recycling. So there was an impact from that. It just wasn't that we kept the recycling. Okay, we can kind of zip through these last
Yeah.
couple slides and then we can start to wrap up.
Sure, yeah. In keeping all that in mind, all that information and context we shared, what is your role as a board, as decision makers in this engagement process, or in any engagement process that you choose to conduct? So you have a role in helping to identify when engagement is required or beneficial. We've talked about this a lot already. Thinking about what's in scope, what's out of scope, where is there actually opportunity for the community to have influence. You also have to act as champions for authentic and meaningful engagement practices, and that looks like supporting the time and resources that are required to include diverse voices, people with lived and living experience. And as we mentioned, as we were doing the icebreaker, meaningful engagement is built off of that foundation of strong relationships. And those relationships require significant and sustained resources and time, whether that be financial support to participate or other ways to reduce barriers to participation. All those are kind of resource intensive elements of meaningful engagement and building trust with the community. And then, as we just talked about, as a board, you have a role of helping to identify what's open for influence and what's not. Where are you flexible in your decision making to incorporate community input? So say you determine all that and you decide that yes, you want to engage with the public. What is your role at that point? So you have a role to help spread the word about what the active engagement is, and attend the sessions to hear directly from members of the community on what their input, what their feedback is. And then I think the second point is your most important role. You have a role to consider and incorporate that input into the maximum degree possible into the final outcome or decision that you're being made. So when being asked after the fact where community input made its way to the decision, you should be able to easily point out in the results where what you heard influenced the decision. So a quick example of this was back in 2022 when we asked the community for their preference for use of outdoor pools in the city. And this was as the Canada Games pool was kind of closing down. We asked community preference for if they would like to use a pre-register system to access the pools, or if they would just like to drop in and show up and access the pools whenever they're open. And we heard mixed results back. It was kind of a 60-40 split between the two. And because there wasn't a clear preference from the community, staff decided to take a hybrid approach on the decision. And they retained the pre-registration system, but also added about 20% of a drop-in spot. So this is a good example about how input that we hear gets incorporated into the decision in a really clear way that we can point to, say like, hey, this is what you said and this is what we did. But we recognize that decisions aren't always that linear. So this is a nice, clear example, but it may not always be so obvious to the community. So we have a role to play in communicating that out to them as well. And then lastly, we have to review and consider who we've heard from and what perspectives may be missing from the conversation. So in other words, how much teeth or grab does the input actually have? So if we're engaging on a dog park, for example, but we only 12% of our participants are dog owners, maybe we need to step back and think about, hey, like, are the people that are really impacted by the decision that we're making in this space about this dog park really sharing their input with us?
All right, so that's kind of our content in terms of what we wanted to share and kind of help you to start thinking about. So now we can kind of shift in our last few minutes to thinking about how you might apply these principles as a board. And I think you've been, through the discussion, you've been doing this all the way through our session, which is great. So again, kind of stepping back from the budget specifically, are there upcoming decisions or initiatives that you have as a board that have significant public impacts? And this would be a place to start thinking about, maybe this is a place where we should engage. And when we say significant public impacts, we're talking about things like, is this going to change people's day-to-day lives in the city? Is this something that would be broadly experienced and potentially negative? Are there negative impacts that a lot of people might experience from this decision or some of the options in the decision? Is there a possibility for public pushback? So always one of the risks of not engaging, if it is a significant decision, like let's say a 30% property tax increase, or we're gonna cut down thousands of trees in Stanley Park, is that you might have a significant public pushback from something, and then you need to press pause, step back, maybe go backwards in your decision-making process, and that can cost us time and money when we have to like walk back things and like reassess and maybe do some engagement where we didn't do it before. So those are some things to think about in terms of questions. And then if there are some upcoming decisions that you have and you know that are coming up that have significant impacts, the next question is, are there meaningful elements of the decision that are flexible, or where there's more than one viable option? We talked a lot throughout today about if everything has been decided, there's really nothing that's open, please don't ask. People are really smart and they can tell when engagement is a checkbox exercise. They know, and they'll be like, you already know what you're gonna do. There's no point in you asking me this. And it doesn't land well. It really doesn't help us with that trust building, that encouraging people to participate next time when it is a genuine opportunity for influence. So we'll maybe leave you with some of these questions. We're happy to stay if you want to dig into them, but I know you've got other things to get to on the agenda. But then specific questions for the budget, and I think we've already kind of grappled with some of this, is what is open for change? Like, I think that if you're looking to do engagement on the budget specifically, which it sounds like we're kind of leaning away from that, which, I think that's probably a wise place to land. But if you are thinking about this, I think the key question is what is open for change? What can actually be adjusted based on what you hear? But some other things to think about here is, what would be the goal or purpose of seeking public input on the budget specifically? What are you curious to know that you don't already know? I mean, I think when it comes to the budget, as Patrick said, like we know people want all the services and they don't want us to pay more for them. Like that's something that I think we can say is true. People don't want to see property tax increases, but they also don't want their services to go down. They want more services. So we don't need to ask about that. I think we know that to be true from a human nature standpoint and based on all of the engagement we have done in recent years for the city's budget. And then I would just say, also think about, the input that we've heard through the city budget engagement in recent years about policing has been really mixed. And I think, from what I've seen in our input is that there are really mixed views about police budget, policing services in our community. And I think we can, expand that to be more of a North American phenomenon. So if you got back something that was really mixed, how might you incorporate that into your decisions? So lots of questions to kind of think about as you move forward.
I think the other part is that the police board would like a little bit more involvement in what the city puts out in the overall budget one, because last year there was like some graphics that maybe weren't quite as representative of policing. Like policing includes HR costs, IT costs, and that was all rolled up. Whereas like the fire department, it didn't include those because that's in the like city budget. So we're just looking at, if we don't consult on this, be a little bit more involved in the pre-work for the citywide budget engagement.
I'm gonna ask Jacqueline to really take that on because, as I think it would be something for Jacqueline to really work with the city's finance team on in terms of having a role in reviewing, maybe checking what some of the messaging is.
Yeah, that's a conversation for our communication, for the police board communications with city communications as well. They probably work with finance to get that together, so.
No, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. Thank you. But before, I do want to get some feelings from the board around, I mean, these are big leading questions, which could lead to a long conversation, but maybe it's something we need to put in the back of our minds and think about, but we do have a bit of time today if we want to have a bit of a conversation about these questions. Like what came to me a little bit out of when we're talking about this is maybe we need to have some public engagement as a board about how we engage the public as a board. we need to get a little meta about this and recognize as we're going through our governance review, and we're sort of shifting how this board operates, maybe that part of that has to be a conversation with the community about like, what do you know about the police board, and how do you need to hear from us, and how do we actually need to shift our public face in order to make it meaningful to people in the community? Maybe that's what we need to engage with before we engage on things like budget or other things. Maybe we need to make it as an opportunity for self-reflection of the board about how we talk to the public. But I do like what is open for change is the part that maybe we have to have a conversation about as well. We even feel a little bit powerless around the budget because, you know, as we know, most of the budget is pretty fixed in basic inflationary increases and stuff, and we always end up in a conversation about enhancements and stuff. But yeah, I don't know how we have that conversation in a truthful way in a truthful engagement way with the public about what we're doing. I don't know, any ideas or comments or questions, or do you want to noodle on this and bring it back as part of our longer discussions about board governance review?
Yeah, I think it makes some sense to kind of look at like how we're engaging as a board with the public prior to kind of going right into like the budget. And there's like lots of ways we could do that. I know like the health authorities have an open board meeting where you don't need to be a delegate, you can come and speak. Like, you know, like there's, not that we need to adopt that, but there's just different ways that boards engage with the public that may enable a little bit more engagement. Yeah, and I'm reticent to go right into the budget with the public not understanding what the police are doing. So I think we need to kind of get the community up to speed with what the police are doing and where we're going, and maybe in that strategy conversation ask for feedback.
I agree.
After this discussion today, it feels like we need to do more communication, more than engagement. Because nothing's really leaping out at me as to what we need to engage on. I mean, certainly, Patrick, we could engage on how we engage. But it feels more like communication is what seemed to be lacking. And even in the feedback that we received, you know, in that last budget round was like, I don't even know what the police do, other than sort of the obvious. So, I mean, maybe more of that will come out in some of our upcoming sort of deep work we have to do on governance and policy and strategic planning. Maybe we can try to think differently about public engagement, but right now it feels more like communication is what we have to tackle.
And again, I want to separate the board from the police department,
Yes.
Yeah.
right? Like we're talking about communication as a board
Yeah.
about what we're doing and how we want to do things, as opposed to what the police department is
Totally.
doing, because the police department does have an engaged communication department that's doing their work.
But
And I
that's
think that's-
comms too.
And that's comms.
And I think that's linked into some of the other discussions we've been having around what supports does the board need
Right.
to do the work of the board.
Right.
I saw your hand on.
Actually, it was about communications too, because for the past 2 weeks have been really bad for me as a business owner in Columbia Street. Every day for the past couple of weeks, I get calls asking if it's safe to come to Columbia, where should they park? I have guests coming to the restaurant and asking if we're safe, how do we feel? And I think that for me, that's really, I think that for someone going to national TV and say that New West is crime is rampant and that it's terrible, it's really affecting my business, and I'm sure that this is going to affect other business. If I'm a landlord, I would have trouble renting space. So I think that for me, that's the thing, is that if the city, like the police or someone goes and asks not just me, like other people, how are you doing? I feel safe. But then also communicating to the public, you know, you can come to Columbia, Columbia is safe. But I can tell you the past 2 weeks have been really bad for us and for the staff, because in 9 years, we never got calls asking if it was safe to come.
It's really terrible.
So I think for me, it's the be heard, but also the communication that just Columbia was safe, Columbia is safe. Like stats are like
Like, is there a role for the police board in that kind of comms?
I think that's more
Like that
Police
feels a
department.
bit,
But I also
Yeah.
feel it's city too,
And city,
because
yeah.
a lot of it's bylaw issues, you know, versus policing issues, right?
But
but
what do
if
you mean
people
by
are
no?
saying crime is terrible and it's not.
Well, safety is not necessarily crime, right?
Right.
When they're saying it feels unsafe, that
That's
doesn't mean that there's
perception.
crime, there's
Yeah.
that, there's like, I think that's city to deal with as well, yeah.
I don't know what that means. When I hear someone say they're not safe, I feel like it's crime.
Yep, I
But-
think that because.
Or people are scared of homeless people on the street and they don't feel.
Yeah, that's what I
Right,
mean, right,
that's not
like,
a
and that's
crime
not a
issue,
crime
that's-
issue, right? Like, I think most people are feeling unsafe because of some of the homelessness in the community.
Yes, but let's go back, the question in here is this, that's not an engagement, this is an engagement
No.
issue, this is a
Yeah.
communications issue,
It's
but it is,
comms.
you're right, who communicates
Who
that?
is
Like,
the comms on that?
and how do we coordinate between the board's role to communicate around what, around within what our role is as the
Yeah.
board? The department's responsibility to
Yeah.
communicate, you know, what our department is doing, and the city's role to communicate what they're doing.
Like, can I ask, you're acting right now? Thank you. I never know who's who. I'm so sorry, but we're all the same. But, so when you hear that kind of stuff going out on national media, do you have a reaction to say, hey, we need to communicate that perhaps that the facts might be different? Like, does that cross your comms, and Haley too, I'm sorry, not to leave you out of that, but does that cross your idea of what the police department needs to communicate about what's factual or not? Or do you just think that's just not our role?
No, I do think that we play a role in that for sure. The first thing I would say is safety. Someone's sense of safety is very subjective.
Of course, yeah.
So someone could walk down there that has a different lived experience or life experience and not be concerned about some of the things like Heather talked about.
Yeah.
Whereas someone else who doesn't have that could be afraid of something they don't really need to be afraid of. So that's one challenge for sure.
Sure.
We try and, again, this is the public conversation around some of the social challenges that we have. We're trying to almost extricate ourselves out of that and focus on, the crime and crime-related issues. But there's other issues, social issues that are not necessarily police responsibility, things that we have very little impact on. So it is a challenge when we're talking about comms and, subjectivity of that. And yes, some people would come downtown and they would see someone that perhaps is homeless or has an addiction challenge or mentally ill. That person doesn't present any kind of threat, but they don't know that. So that's where it's coming from for I think a lot of people. So there's definitely an education piece for somebody there to talk about that. We try and stick more just the facts, like, if there's an issue that happens in downtown that the police are dealing with, we report out on that. We do record statistics specific to the downtown and other areas, report out on that. So people can have, this is the data. Oftentimes what we do find as well, and what we try and communicate is that the people that are marginalized or have some of these challenges, they're the ones being victimized oftentimes. It's not generally members of the public.
Yeah.
It's these individuals that are being targeted and victimized for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk about. So the issues are complex. We try and stay away from saying, is it safe or is it not?
Yeah.
Try and just get the data as best we have it, and then try and engage in some of those more complex discussions. I mean, fixing these issues that we're facing in society are very complex and needs everyone at the table. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I would add that we communicate often that we're working in partnership with other city departments and other nonprofits as well. So that's one of our repeating messages to members of the public, because often people will see something that causes them concern and they'll say, well, what's being done? So that answers that question.
Yes, but actually the news story was about crime was rampant. It wasn't about homeless, like that was part of that. But one of the focus is that crime is just terrible.
Yeah.
And I haven't smashed windows. I don't really see that. I think that one individual is having issues, and I think that for me that was the news story. And I think that for me it was a chance for us to go and say, actually, if you look at the stats, so absurd. And I think that for me that was a missed opportunity, and we're still dealing with that. And again, I don't know how many other businesses are dealing with that, or that landlords will be dealing with the aftermath of the situation that yes.
The second challenge we face as well is obviously public trust is important for the police. It's kind of the cornerstone of what we do. So for us we want to be transparent and communicate what we're doing. Yeah, we're trying to balance that. We're not trying to scare anybody or create a false sense of what's going on, but sometimes bad things happen and it's important for us to report out on what they are. So it's that balance where, all the conversations we have with comms are around that. Like, we want to balance, public trust, transparency, and telling the truth, because if we pull back from that or start putting out less information, that's when we start getting hammered saying, well, the police aren't telling us what's going on or what they're up to.
Yeah.
So we've dropped into, as we always do in public engagement, we've dropped into talking about communications.
That's okay.
It's fine, you
We're
know, it's
calling
fine.
it communications
Yeah,
now.
it is
Yeah.
communications.
Yeah, but I do wanna, so I want us to continue to think about this, and I think maybe we've, disabused ourselves of the idea that we wanna do a really intensive public engagement process around this upcoming budget right now, but we do. The city is still noodling, I think, on how their public engagement process is gonna look. But I guess I'll take it on as the person on both boards to make sure that however council makes that decision, whatever, they will be willing to try to engage the police board in that effort. I think part of it is the police board feels a little separate from that, and if the city does do engagement on the budget, for example, we want to make sure the police board has a piece of that information because we are representing, 20%, 25% of the city's budget. We want to make sure we have some space in that to share, ask questions if we have questions to ask, or make sure the information that's coming from the police side is accurate and reflects our reality as the police board, our decision-making abilities, police board, right? But other than that, we can connect, if we decide to go down an engagement path, what services does the city's public engagement department, your massively expanding department, what services, like, because if we do decide as we go through our board update and changes, and if we decide we want to go in and do a public engagement process around the board, how do you provide that for us? Can you guide us through that? Do we hire contractors probably to help with the development? How does that work? How would the board expect that to work?
Yeah, I mean, so our capacity is growing a little bit. So I would say it depends. I would say it really depends. So please feel free to reach out to us again. We would be happy to come and do like a similar kind of session with you to, workshop, if you're thinking about doing engagement, and, we could come and workshop with you, like what is open for influence? Where are those areas within that scope of engagement, the smaller bubble? And talk around, objectives for engagement, and then, what methods you might want to pursue, depending on how kind of large in scope that conversation would be and what else we have on our project list at the time. We may be able to help you if it's something a little smaller scale, or we may have a conversation at that time about, hiring a contractor to help you do that work if it is something that is a bit of a larger process.
It takes resources. I
Yeah.
mean, true engagement takes resources. It takes people preparing materials and having conversations and building relationships, and that's a resource intensive activity compared to communications.
And I will say, one of the city's principles in our public engagement policy is that, really there should be multiple methods to participate, and we should include in-person and online options. We want to try, if you're really genuinely wanting to hear from a wide variety of folks, it needs to be really easy to participate, and we need to go where people are. So we do a lot of things like pop-ups, showing up in high traffic areas or where the people are who we want to talk to. So all of that definitely takes resources.
Okay, any final words?
Thank you. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks.
Thank you for coming in and doing this for us. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this. And I learn a little bit every time you talk. I've been through a few of these now and I keep on learning about it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, our pleasure. Please, we'll obviously share the slides with you so you can look back at some of those questions as you continue to think about what does engagement look like for you as a board and where to maybe start. And yeah, we're happy to take questions from you as well as you go down that road.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Move receipt of the report.
So moved.
Second, all in favor, all opposed, carried. We should take a couple of minute break and then we'll go into closed.
Sure.
Yeah, just to get the streaming work and everything, just a couple of minutes, then we'll start closing, like 2 minutes. Thanks.